Under the Defense Production Act, federal agencies can require companies to prioritize government contracts during a national emergency like the COVID-19 pandemic. But there have been some challenges in using that authority, according to a GAO report. Bill Russell is Director for Contracting and National Security Acquisitions at the Government Accountability Office. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be here, Mimi.
So in the early part of the pandemic, there was a huge need for PPE, right? Personal protective equipment and ventilators. How was the Defense Production Act used during that time?
If you think back to the beginning of the pandemic in March and April of 2020, quickly the existing medical supplies for PPE, ventilators, a lot of the commodities needed to respond to the pandemic were in short supply. The DPA was an instrumental tool to help acquire the available stock of those items. Think about the ventilators early in the pandemic, as well as N95 masks, other medical supplies that were needed to treat the patients.
Then later in the pandemic, there was the issue of vaccine manufacturing. Was the Defense Production Act used for that?
It was a key tool that supported the development and the manufacturing of the vaccines. That included the actual doses that we all heard about later in the pandemic, but as well as the supporting ancillary equipment that you need, things like syringes, right, and the medical swabs and other things that you need involved with vaccine development.
So, Bill, how does the DPA actually work? Like, how does it allow agencies to provide incentives to private companies to expand their domestic production of these medical supplies that we're talking about for the pandemic, but also for them to reduce their foreign dependence on those supplies?
Certainly, one key aspect of the DPA has to do with expanding domestic production of critical items. And certainly we saw over the course of our work, the DPA used in that way or similar authorities more than 60 times. And in many of those cases, it's a matter of providing loans or other incentives to, for example, buy equipment to make more N95 masks to support, let's say, creating another shift on the production line, or even standing up a new production facility. And so we've seen that a number of times over the course of our work in this area. But N95 masks is a great example. The production went from a little bit more than 50 million a month to almost quadruple that after the investment devoted to companies through the DPA.
So then what were the biggest challenges that you found that agencies faced when they were using the authorities of the DPA?
Early on in the pandemic, the first challenge was to effectively move federal resources from one agency to another. For example, HHS had contracts in place for things like N95 masks, but they needed DoD support to help put the DPA clauses on the contracts and do some of the logistics involved with it. And so effective use of the Economy Act and other authorities was key. DoD implemented that lesson learned and created a playbook for how to do that more effectively going forward. Another challenge had to do with HHS and FEMA, just were not accustomed to using the DPA and all of its authorities. And since the beginning of the pandemic have devoted more resources and staff and training to effectively use the DPA going forward.
All right, so GAO had made recommendations previously. What were those recommendations and what have the results been so far?
Right. The first one had to do with just the transparency in federal procurement data of when the DPA was used, and we made a recommendation that OMB provide additional guidance to agencies on how to flag when the DPA is used. And I'm happy to report that OMB has implemented that recommendation. The second had to do with HHS and sort of a forward-looking rec to think about how they want to use the DPA to address remaining medical supply challenges. And HHS is working on implementing that recommendation.
And there are new recommendations that you're making with this new report. What are those?
This report really just captured the work that we had already completed, so we did not make any new recommendations. We do point out that with the American Recovery Act, there's another $10 billion in DPA funding that can go to support further expansion of the medical supply base domestically. And so we will continue to track those funds as they're expended.
And lastly, Bill, the DPA was enacted back in 1950 during the Korean War. Is this the first time it's been used for medical supplies?
Certainly at the size and scale to respond to the pandemic, with multiple agencies leveraging their resources and the DPA authorities to acquire all of the medical supplies, vaccines, therapeutics that we've needed. It's unprecedented the scale that's been used for this pandemic.
All right. Well, Bill, I appreciate you coming on the program and sharing your report with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.